Ecuador's President Guillermo Lasso has accused the country's Indigenous Confederation of wanting to overthrow democracy, as social movements announce new mobilizations against fuel price hikes and his government's neoliberal policies. The Chinese government has dismissed the United States' accusations that it is rapidly expanding its nuclear arsenal. Palestinians celebrated the news of the release of Hisham Abu Huwash after 140 days of hunger strike against his detention without charges or trial by the occupying Israeli regime. From the headquarters of TeleSUR English in Havana, Cuba, this is From the South. I'm your anchor, Gladys Quesada, and these are the news. Ecuador's President Guillermo Lasso has accused the country's Indigenous Confederation of wanting to overthrow democracy, as social movements announce new mobilizations against fuel price hikes and his government's neoliberal policies. In an interview, President Lasso headed out a Leonidas Liza, the president of the Confederation of Indigenous Nationalities of Ecuador, which led major protests in October against fuel price hikes. Talks with the government stalled in November as the Confederation denounced a lack of progress in the issue of fuel subsidies. Indigenous peoples are also demanding an end to the exploitation of natural resources in the areas where they live, and denounced the neoliberal economic policies harming the majority of the Ecuadorian population. Fresh mobilizations have been called for mid-January as the Lasso government refuses to negotiate.
Campesinos y líderes sindicales tras encabezar una marcha pacífica de unos 200 seguidores. Quito decidió aplicar en mayo de 2020 ajustes mensuales para eliminar millonarios subsidios ante una crisis económica agravada por la pandemia. Esta política fue mantenida por Lasso, quien asumió hace casi 6 meses.
Now we continue. The opening of a trial against 5 former Guatemalan paramilitaries for sexual violence against 36 indigenous Mayan women in the 1980s was suspended on Tuesday and postponed until Wednesday due to the absence of the defense lawyer. Before the suspension, victims, survivors, and support organizations held a Mayan ceremony outside the Supreme Court of Justice in the capital, where the oral hearing and public trial will take place. According to the Washington Office of Latin America, the case is emblematic because it is only the second time that a case of sexual violence against indigenous women during the internal armed conflict will be tried in Guatemalan courts. The defendants, former members of the government-created paramilitary civil defense patrols, heard the decision via video conference from the prison where they are being held. A United Nations Truth Commission, which investigated war crimes in Guatemala, documented over 600 massacres and found that 93% of all violations were committed by state apparatus.
We stand with the Archie women who were raped, who were subjected to various types of violence during the armed conflict, who were raped many times. Not just one rape, but they suffered many rapes, but they also suffered the enforced disappearance of their husbands. Some of their husbands were executed in front of them, and they suffered the enforced disappearance of their children.
In the midst of the health crisis, Brazil has also been plagued by a socio-economic crisis over the past year. The country has record unemployment rate, 20 million Brazilians are going hungry, and inflation is above 10%. We have more details in the following report with our correspondent Andre Vieira and Sebastián Soro.
2021 began with the interruption of the pandemic aid paid by the government to almost 68 million Brazilians. The welfare initiative returned in April, excluding half those who benefited before and paying 4 times less. Then in December, the government launched the Auxílio Brasil program, which excluded more than 22 million families served by the pandemic welfare program last year. 2021 was also the year of record prices for meat and gasoline, and an inflation rate above 10%. And there is the inflation issue again. And this is linked to the position of the current government. The economic proposal, since we have an inflation rate that is not linked to demand, but to the supply, and fundamentally administered prices. We're talking about the price of fuel, which is set by the Petrobras price policy. We're talking about electric energy, which is another administered price. We're talking about the price of food. Research by the Pension Network shows that more than 20 million Brazilians are hungry, and that 55% of the country's population is experiencing food insecurity. This rate has increased since the 2016 coup d'etat against former President Dilma Rousseff. In 2021, unemployment reached its highest level in history. There were 14.8 million people out of work in June. Last year ended with 38 million working in the informal economy and almost 13 million unemployed.
It's really very expensive and very difficult. We do not know what to do. It is complicated. I have many friends who were domestic workers and lost their jobs. The level of poverty has increased dramatically. The number of people living on the street has also increased. They were already homeless here, but with the pandemic, the number tripled. And all of this is a consequence of the coup that Brazil experienced. It is always good to remember that, because we cannot forget history.
When the pandemic began in 2020, more than 220,000 people were living on the streets in Brazil, and according to estimates, this number has increased. Over the past year, rent increased by almost 18%. Monica had to leave her home and begin living in a square.
I was living in a place where they increased the rent, and I couldn't afford to pay it, so I ended up on the streets.
The past year was also a year of solidarity, a year of great solidarity. Research by the Data Favela Institute showed that 92% of the inhabitants of impoverished communities that received donations would not have been able to eat in 2021 if it were not for the social mobilization. The Landless Movement alone has donated more than 1 million lunches and 5,000 tons of food since the beginning of the pandemic throughout the country. The pattern of hunger has been reestablished in Brazil and is linked to informalization of the labor market, of the economy, but also the breakdown of social welfare programs. What used to work is no longer working. For 2022, the last year of Jair Bolsonaro's mandate and the year of the electoral campaign, the market expects growth of less than half a percentage point. Brazil is not suffering from any external blockade and will have to make an internal decision this year about its future and the quality of life of its people.
André Vieira e Sebastião Soto, TeleSUR, Rio de Janeiro, Brasil.
Thank you to our correspondents for this report, and now we continue to other topics. The Canadian government has announced an agreement with principle with the country's First Nations to compensate Indigenous children and their families who were harmed by discrimination and underfunding of the country's child welfare system. The deal is stalled to end the human rights challenge that was launched 14 years ago. Approximately $20 billion will be used to pay compensation to the victims, while the other $20 billion will be spent on reforming the system over 5 years. Following a complaint filed in 2007, the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal ruled in 2016 that Ottawa discriminated against First Nations children who lived on reserves because of its chronic underfunding of family and child services in their communities. Under the agreement, First Nations children who were removed from their homes will be compensated, along with their parents and caregivers. Canada has been rocked by a series of scandals regarding its treatment of Indigenous communities, with over 1,000 bodies of Indigenous children forced to attend boarding schools, where abuse was rife, discovered in mass graves last year.
The federal child welfare program was broken from the start. Most Canadians do not know this, that there was actually an incentive for child welfare agencies to remove children. In fact, a First Nations child welfare agency would not receive funding unless the child was removed from their home and placed into foster care. This historic settlement of $40 billion has been a long time coming. First Nations from across Canada have had to work very hard for this day to provide redress for monumental wrongs against First Nation children, wrongs fueled by an inherently biased system. We have a long way to go to address the poverty in our nations, and no amount of money will ever be the right amount, nor will it bring back a childhood lost. But today is about acknowledgement, about being seen and heard.
And we'll be right back after this very short break, so don't go away. Welcome back. The Chinese government has dismissed United States accusations that it's rapidly expanding its nuclear arsenal, just a day after 5 world powers issued a rare joint statement pledging to prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons. A senior Chinese arms control official stressed the claims his government was dramatically increasing its nuclear capabilities weren't true, but noted instead that steps are being taken to modernize Chinese nuclear forces in the interest of national defense. While the U.S. Defense Department claimed in a report in November that China is expanding its nuclear force faster than previously projected and could have more than 1,000 warheads by 2030, the fact is that the U.S. has almost 4,000 nuclear weapons and remains the only nation to have used them in war.
I think this is important by itself, but also especially against the current backdrop.
Now we address other topics. In Venezuela, a new phase of the vaccination campaign began on Monday as booster doses were rolled out for the at-risk population. The vaccination rate is around 90%. We have more details in the following report with our correspondent, Leonel Retamal.
Venezuelan citizens is receiving this booster dose after receiving the second dose of the COVID vaccine 6 months ago. He calls on the public to start the vaccination cellular or reinforce it with this third dose.
Que no hagan caso de esas consejas de que dicen que las vacunas no funcionan. Si no funcionaran,
do not listen to those who say that the vaccine does not work. If it did not work, the damage caused will be much greater. I have confidence in the science, technology, and health policies that are being implemented worldwide to combat the coronavirus. This is the vaccination center located in the Hotel Alba, Caracas, a regular site for the COVID vaccination campaign. In this new phase, which began on Monday 3rd January, citizens are free to turn up to reinforcement the vaccination cellular or to start it, like the citizens who fortunately has been safe from infection. I haven't had it, but I follow the rules of the mask. I use antibacterial gel, everything that is required, and that is within one's reach to take care of oneself. It is a fast and reliable process. In the past, this health team has vaccinated more than 20,000 people per month. They call on the population to get vaccinated in view of the danger of the arrival of new variants of the virus in Venezuela.
We are administering first, second, and third doses. First and second doses of the varicella vaccine, and the booster is a third dose, the same dose. Everyone is given a dose. Those who have had varicella are given varicella, and those who have had Sputnik are given the Sputnik Light booster.
Venezuela is also vaccinating children between the age of 3 and 17 years, following the return of face-to-face class. Vaccination is also safe for pregnant and lactating women.
Don't be afraid. We are going to shake it off that fear. We are going to bring the children to immunize them against the pandemic, to protect them in one way or another, and to continue fighting this pandemic, to continue being free, as we Venezuelans and our republic have been.
World Health Organization data points to the need to further promote vaccination to counteract the emergence of new variants and to reduce the lethality of the virus.
The idea is that those who already have their second dose complete their boosters to complete their immunogenicity, so that if you are exposed to the SARS-CoV-2 virus in any of its variants, you avoid complications that could lead to death.
with almost 90% of the population vaccinated with at least one dose. Venezuela has kept the entry of new variants at bay and maintains a low infection rate of 5 per 100,000 inhabitants.
Leonel Retamal y Jesús Romero, TeleSUR Caracas, Venezuela.
Thank you, Leonel, for this report, and we have more stories coming up after this final short break, so stay with us. Welcome back. Palestinians celebrated the news of the release of Hisham Abu Huwash after 141 days on hunger strike against his detention without charges or trial by the occupying Israeli regime. Huwash, age 40, agreed to end his hunger strike this Tuesday after Israel committed to his release by February 26, according to his lawyer. The International Committee of the Red Cross, whose medical teams visited the Palestinian prisoner over the weekend, warned he was in critical condition and called for a solution to prevent his death. The married father of 5 from Dura, in the south of the Israeli-occupied West Bank, is being held under administrative detention, an internationally condemned Israeli practice of arresting Palestinians for renewable 6-month terms without allowing them to view the charges or evidence against them.
During the past 3 days, we lived through a psychological war that was carried out by the Israeli intelligence due to what was happening with my brother Hisham. There were strong maneuvers, but we overpassed those as a family. Today, Hisham achieved victory for all the Palestinians.
I thank all the Palestinians who stood with us. Thanks to everyone who helped my brother. I thank God they released him. Thank you to every person who took part, helped, and provided support. Thank you all.
The International Organization for Migration has expressed concern about the continued displacement of Afghans since the return to power of the Taliban. According to data compiled by the IOM, over 600,000 Afghans were displaced in 2021 because of conflict. There are now 5.5 million internally displaced people in Afghanistan, a nation that suffered 20 years of war and foreign occupation. As Western states abandoned the nation, the international community also stopped providing funds to a country heavily dependent on foreign aid, only worsening the plight of its population. South African investigators on Tuesday handed over the first installment of a long-awaited report into state corruption under former President Jacob Zuma. After 4 years' work with an investigation involving more than 300 witnesses, the first part of the corruption inquiry report was handed over to President Cyril Ramaphosa, who has vowed to root out graft and financial sleaze. The president described the event as a defining moment in the effort to definitely end the era of state capture and to restore the integrity of the institutions. Ramaphosa said he will brief Parliament by the end of June of his response to the report, drawn up by a top-level commission which does not itself have powers of prosecution.
State capture has damaged people's confidence in the rule of law, in public institutions, in law enforcement agencies, and even to some extent in the democratic process. That is what makes the work of this commission so essential. This report enables us to up our tempo in dealing with state capture, and I am sure that if we all work together, we will be able to rid our country of gross acts of corruption that we have seen in the past.
Sudanese protesters took to the streets of the capital of Khartoum and other cities once again on Tuesday to reject the return to full military rule, following the resignation of the Prime Minister earlier this week. Security forces fired tear gas to disperse protesters in several locations in the capital, including the area around the presidential palace, which has seen violent repression of protesters in previous mobilizations since the October 25th coup. Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok, who was ousted by the military, only to be reinstated a month later following a deal meant to calm tensions and under international pressure, stepped down on Sunday amid political deadlock, saying he had failed to find a compromise between the ruling generals and also the pro-democracy movement. And we have come to the end of this news brief. But remember, you can find these and many other stories on our website at telesurenglish.net. And also, if you feel so inclined, please join us on social media for all the latest news. We are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Telegram. For TeleSUR English, I'm Gladys Quesada. Thank you for watching.